Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering. In this episode, I talked to Matthew Lynley. Matt's a bit of a hybrid. He's been a longtime journalist covering enterprise tech, and he's also been a hands-on keyboard data practitioner. I am always fascinated by folks who have their feet planted in two different worlds. Matt and I have gotten to know each other over the past few years as he's covered the analytics tech stack. But in the past, it's always been him interviewing me. This time, I wanted to turn the tables on him and get his perspective on the world of AI. With his newsletter, Supervised, he's done a fantastic job of covering all of the developments in AI at exactly the right level of specificity that I had been looking for. And I am an avid reader. In this conversation, we talk about Matt's journey, the rise of Gen AI as a topic in the popular press, what's going on in the space today, and where he thinks AI is headed. I love the conversation and hope we can have Matt back on in the future. Without further ado, let's get into it. Matt Lynley, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I feel like we've known each other long enough that this is long overdue now.
You've been a data practitioner. You've been a journalist. You recently started your own Substack called Supervised. Are you a podcaster too? Are we data podcast competitors?
Oh no, but everyone is sort of like, when are you starting a podcast? Because every Substacker has a podcast, and they're just like, guys, like, yeah. I'm scrambling to barely keep up with publishing, so I don't know how anyone else does this.
Well, your newsletter is fantastic. Can you talk a little bit about your journey as a professional? Because it's a little unusual to have somebody employed as a journalist writing about the space that actually has done the work of a practitioner too. Like, tell your story.
Yeah. So basically, my original background is in applied mathematics. So that's my degree. Don't look at my GPA, please. But like in the long ancient history, I was studying engineering and all that kind of stuff. And just kind of like fell into journalism because I got a job and I just had no interest in going to grad school. And
what was your first gig in journalism?
It was writing about video games for VentureBeat. So I'm sitting here in New York at an internship, and Matt Marshall calls me and is like, "Hey, you want to like move to San Francisco and like write about enterprise tech and video games? And it's like, and we'll pay you $10 an hour." I was like, "Hell yeah, man!" Like I'm like 23, like move to San Francisco, sure, why not? Sounds great.
That sounds like fun. Yeah. That predates Fortnite. What was the big game?
Oh, this was 2010. So this was like Call of Duty, like World of Warcraft, like all the old school stuff. Like we hadn't even gotten to like Minecraft was not even a thing back then. So this is like old.
That's good. I mean, like if you were covering the video game industry today, I think that might be kind of a miserable beat.
Oh God.
I feel like
I don't wish it on anyone. So, but yeah. So but the other half of that was like enterprise tech, and then kind of got immersed in that a little bit. But I mean, I was like an early Twitter user and like had like an early iPhone and all that kind of stuff. So I always loved tech. So as a journalist for that would have been about 8 years or so. My last stop being at TechCrunch, where I was starting to cover very early AI development. So, the Transformers paper had like just come out. If I'm remembering the dates here correctly, like BERT had also just come out like towards the end of my time there. And like the early AI silicon companies were starting to pop up a little bit. But I like obviously like had a craving to get back to doing something a little bit more technical, because I'd sort of like gotten away from that a little bit, and I just sort of wanted to go, and I was hacking on stuff on the side and all that. That my GitHub repo is private, and so I wanted to do something a little bit more technical again. Washed out of journalism into working in a variety of different roles, all kind of touching on very data centric projects. So, when I was at Brex, we were analyzing our data to look at spending trends and things like that. When I was at Cloud Guru, we were looking at the way people were using our products to understand, how things are evolving in the cloud industry. so on and so on and so forth. And all this time, like obviously, like I'm using the same janky setups that everyone else has, right? So like Snowflake, like Datacrypt, like all the rest of these things, right? And towards the end of that, I was kind of like trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. We had just gotten acquired by Pluralsight, and this opportunity kind of came up to this idea came up to coming back to journalism to write about the stuff that I'd use. So I would come back with like a little bit of a different perspective for covering like Snowflake and weights and biases. Like we were users of that, like or I was a user, and Hugging Face, like I'm part of their ARR for like several years running, right? And all of that. And it seemed like a cool opportunity, mostly because like it was one of the only things I was good at, and decent at.
Was this at Insider?
This is when I went to Business Insider, yeah, to cover.
And
this
okay.
obviously predates ChatGPT, right? So like we're talking like MDS chaos, like everything everywhere, everyone getting like $1 billion valuation somehow. And so that obviously was a really fast and really interesting area. Like Snowflake and Databricks were two of the hottest companies, or still are two of the hottest companies in that area. And just there was a lot of stuff evolving really quickly, like Streamlit. Obviously, I was a Streamlit user, and Snowflake had acquired Streamlit and all that. And then November happened, right? And like GPT-3 was it already existed, right? And like there were some companies that were like using it.
Okay, wait. Before you get there, before ChatGPT, you're writing about quote unquote the modern data stack and all the developments in this world. You get to see all the analytics behind your posts, right?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yeah.
So what kinds of things in that world drove reader attention? Series A company gets funded, or Databricks launches a new feature, or what? Like what was your intuition that you built over time on like what kind of the general public that read Business Insider cared about?
So I don't know if I can go like into too specifically into like the details of like one post doing better than another.
Yeah.
But what I found was that there is this unique appetite for going like one layer lower than the kind of like broader like like startup X raises $1 gazillion at valuation Y or something like that, and understanding the kind of like intricacies of how they were adopted and used internally, and like what those kinds of conversations were looking like. So not what the CEO was saying on an earnings call, but like what's the head of data saying to like his CTO or her CTO, saying like, hey, I want to buy this 50 weights and biases licenses, and the CTO is like, what's weights and biases? Like I have no idea what you're talking about, right? And so there was this kind of like I felt and saw there was this kind of this gap for something that could go after people that just like time strapped like we are, trying to like make these multi-million dollar like multi-year decisions, because like God bless you if you're able to get Snowflake up and running in the first year, and without going like all the way down to the minutia of like one platform over another or something like that. And kind of like fell into that like niche. And the MDS, I think, like just at the time was just, I felt like it was just very undercovered, right? Because it was, I think, outside of the people in the industry, it was underappreciated how like ridiculous this had gotten, right? Right, with like the sheer number of like companies and products that had sort of emerged over time, and like the daisy chain that like somehow like continued to get longer and longer and longer.
But you also had your own perspectives around like what among those products was actually generating value.
To a certain extent, right? I mean, all this was still up in the air, right?
Sure.
Going back to 22, I guess was around the time this is I was doing this kind of stuff, but it was also like early day. It was, I mean, Snowflake had been around for a while, but it still felt like kind of early days for Snowflake and Databricks in terms of like their sort of like storyline and growth trajectory and arc. And the like you could see it, like, I mean, obviously there's all these startups, but you could see the growth there in the numbers with Snowflake, right? Like you could see like what was happening and where things were moving in the industry, within the numbers there.
It is a funny dynamic being like the only publicly traded company amongst this huge ecosystem. Everybody kind of latches onto your public financials around like, how is this whole space doing?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you remember, but I think it was like mid 22 where everyone was like, oh crap, like consumption's going down because it's on Snowflake, it went down this one quarter and everyone like flipped out. And then it turned out, I think that was like not exactly the case or like what exactly happened there. But this is like 2 years ago at this point, which is insane to I'm like trying to recall the specifics of all this kind of stuff. But I mean, that was the barometer, right? We had that as like, and then I guess like maybe Datadog and Confluent maybe was like one potential one you could look at, and a couple others, right? To sort of like watch here to follow and kind of read the tea leaves to understand like where things are going with like the not quite the like B of A's, but like everyone kind of under there that was still up for grabs more or less.
We get to November 2022 and the whole world kind of explodes a little bit. And I had already hit a point where I had gotten a little tired of Twitter. I don't know. Everybody goes through their own cycles with social media. So I was no longer like drinking the fire hose every single day. And somebody, I think it was Ben Stancil at Mode. He included a screenshot from ChatGPT in one of his posts, and I was just like, I don't know what this is. And I felt myself. If you missed this thing for a week, you were hopelessly out of the loop. Can you talk about you kind of saw this from the other side. Why did this generate so much coverage? Is it because it's just a good story and it generates eyeballs and so it gets covered, or is there cynicism there? Like, oh, people will read this, but I think it's stupid. There's a lot of people that have covered AI in the past year and a half that like they have literally no background in tech reporting like whatsoever.
Yeah, I think what was different about ChatGPT, almost in the same way as like Instagram and Foursquare and some of the early like iPhone or iPhone 4 apps, was like you got it right away. Like the second it was in your hands, like you could understand what it was and it was working in front of you and it was doing like really crazy stuff and really weird stuff, right? It was like getting a lot of stuff wrong. So like a lot of, I mean, I'm sure following.
But it wasn't like you needed to explain to your CTO what weights and biases was. Like
right.
It was really freaking obvious.
Right. And I mean, I think also part of it was just some of the answers were so ridiculous and comical that they went viral on like Twitter and stuff like that. And they're all, and we had to throw a name on it and we called it hallucinations, which I still think is a bad name personally. So there was like an air of like comedy around like what was happening with it to a certain extent too. But it was really cool. And it was like, I think when it first came out, there had been such a pent up craving for something like really new, like something that like actually had a chance to like change the way we interacted with technology, because like we'd have like,
and like maybe hopeful. There's plenty of new stuff.
Yeah. I mean, like you go back to like 2014, 15, 16, and everyone was like, oh my God, like local and like solo mode, like social local mode, whatever, like the crazy acronyms was, what did we get out of that? We got Uber and DoorDash, right? Which is, I mean, they're super useful, but like, are they like life altering generational technologies in the same way that like, the original set like JSON wrapped APIs were? Probably not really. And so there was just this, I think in general, there was just this like pessimism in tech, especially like as like the Cambridge Analytica stuff was happening with Facebook and a lot on the consumer side, and like on the enterprise side too, we were kind of like pessimistic about like a lot of like the product developments and stuff like that, even though like during this whole time, like storage costs are dropping and things are great, right? And so there was a craving for something like new and really cool and really interesting, and like had a chance to like actually was like a generational like industry altering technology. And what we saw with ChatGPT was that we had never seen a technology like it before. Like, granted, like to be clear, like we've been using LLMs for a while, like with BERT and stuff like that, right? But like we never seen a technology like that before, and that really has not happened since like iPhone, right? Since like Safari on your phone, right? Like it's call it 13 years or 12 years or something like that. And so kind of you use the phrase like hopeful. And I think that one of the things it did is kind of like wake people up out of the like pessimistic, I'm addicted to Instagram and I hate this, and like all I'm doing is flipping through TikToks, and I'm using the same like crappy SQL server as everyone else, and so on and so forth, right? Well, that's not a good example, right? But because we did get Snowflake before this, but at least on the consumer side, there was just something like to get excited about for the first time in a really, really long time. Obviously, when that happens, like the first thing that happens is like everyone is like, okay, like how do we integrate this into our business and all that kind of stuff? And like, I mean, the point is there was just so much potential, right? Everyone saw this like insane amount of potential, and everyone saw where it could possibly go, and there were like infinite permutations. Like everyone was hacking away at it, like hacking on the edges, trying to figure out what to do with it. They were like breaking it, jailbreaking it, like making it do crazy stuff.
The slice of readership metrics that you got to see convinced you that like the interest was real. Posts about AI really did generate interest in your readership.
So there's a one part of this though is the part of this whole story was I was on leave for the beginning of 2023,
okay.
right? So I was kind of on the like ChatGPT had just come out, but I was I had to take a step back from work for a little while.
So the reason I asked that question is just that AI is a pretty significant focus of Supervised, of your current newsletter.
Yeah.
I have to imagine that and you and I haven't talked about this, so you tell me if this is wrong, but I have to imagine that part of the thinking that was going on in your head when you decided to go out on your own was not just that like, hey, people seem to be starting Substacks and everybody's getting rich, and so hell yeah, me too. You probably recognize that there's a real appetite for content about AI, and there's probably realized that you have a unique perspective here in that you both have the skill sets of the reporter as well as the skill sets of a practitioner. Maybe not like the person who's designing the language model, but like you can absolutely yourself like use these language models. Is that where Supervised came from?
Well, I mean, honestly, like when I make some catastrophic that like may or may not be good life decision, honestly, like what I do is I just call like 100 people and ask them what they think. And honestly, what part of the impetus was like as I was sort of like watching all this stuff develop, I was looking for something to read, like selfishly, like what I was interested in. And I was just asking around. I was just like, hey, like, what are you reading? Like, what do you like? Who do you follow? And it's like Hacker News Discord.
There's
like,
this really interesting, right? There's like the content that exists at like the Harvard Business Review, Forbes level, which is like very abstracted away from the details. And then there's like, or you could read abstracts on
Archive.
papers on Archive.
Yeah.
Right. And there really isn't a lot of like this middle level of detail.
Yeah. And I think that that's part of like, and what you're talking about, it's like buried in Hacker News threads, right? Or buried in like Discords or Slacks, right? All that other stuff where like the practitioners are like screwing around with all this stuff. One of the specific appeals about AI was that like anyone could like take it and run with it. That was another part of it, is like the GPT-3.5 Turbo APIs it's like so easy to use, alarmingly easy to use, to the point you can rack up a build really fast. And like then we started getting other APIs like really fast. Then we got Llama, and then Llama CPP on top of it, so people could do stuff on their laptop. And then like like people were like building customization components for it, so there was tweaking their own personal LLMs to like be like my roommate in college, like act like him or her, right? All that kind of stuff. And so I didn't see that, right? I didn't see something serving that like pulled Llama off Hugging Face, running it on my laptop, LangChain is orchestrating everything, like I'm just like messing around with stuff. And these projects are all like future like $50 billion companies, right? And then on the flip side, like people within organizations that are like, hey, like we need an AI strategy, right? Because everyone else has an AI strategy, which is like may or may not be a good decision, but it was a from the heavens order for most, if not all, companies. And so they were figuring out like, okay, like what do we do with this? How do we apply it? Like, there's way too much stuff out there. Like, what is open source? Like, because we didn't even understand open source back then, right? A lot of these companies didn't. And so it just looked like it just wasn't there. And so I was like, oh crap, like I guess I'm doing it, right?
How long's it been? Have you been doing this for a year?
May is a year, so 10 months.
Successful life decision so far?
Life decision,
Too much thought.
I don't know if I don't go out of my way to recommend it to people to start your own company or start a newsletter. I'll say it like that. Like, I mean, if, like, you know, it's running your own thing.
I have so much respect for people who get paid to write Substacks because it's hard to get free subscriber growth. As somebody who like operates my own newsletter, it's non-trivially challenging to just get growth in that space. And you know, it's one thing if you're like writing a general interest newsletter, like, you know, about politics or whatever, but if you're writing about data even like AI, which is a pretty hot topic right now, but you're writing about it at a level of technical depth that, like, if you're not in the industry, you probably don't want to read that. So it's like, it's a hard job to make money off the thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's also terrifying when people are paying you because you're like, oh crap, like what am I doing here? Okay, like the bar is suddenly like rising every month, right? So it's like, I hope I'm not screwing this up. 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 So, but I mean, it is a challenge, right? I mean, there's a lot of noise in the industry, and like there are a lot of like newsletters in the industry, and there are a lot of like publications in the industry, and like I'm, you know, have to contend with the fact that I'm writing about the stuff that this, you know, Wall Street Journal and the Information and all that other stuff is writing about. And so it's kind of like, how do you like what do I have like what like angle can I take here that others might not possibly be able to take? Well, it's like, well, like I have worked in publications before, so I kind of have a better understanding of like what tends to resonate with like a bigger audience, right? I think don't quote me on that. but I mean, you know, I have experience like sort of with audience development and growth because you have to build your own brand and blah 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 blah, right? And like obviously there's a benefit to like walking into doing this having invested a lot of time in building up an audience and all that kind of stuff, right? So if I did it like blind,
how often are you actually playing with the stuff that you cover yourself?
Every day, probably. Like it's at least like a couple hours every day. Like I'm on a like now year-long quest to get AI to write my content for me. I have not figured it out yet. Like if anyone can figure this out, like please tell me. Like if the Times can figure it out, awesome. I'll pay for whatever product you have so I don't have to like do this writing, and I could spend all my time like messing with stuff and talking to people and like going to events and.
You want to like feed a bunch of notes into a prompt and have it like construct a cohesive narrative?
I don't know if I call it cohesive narrative, but it's like, okay, like here's like, I mean, the part of the thesis behind Supervised is like, what's everyone talking about that no one's writing about, right? And like, you know, like news events happen or whatever, right? And all that kind of stuff. But you know, one thing, you know, it's sort of when I think about what is an issue and Supervised looks like, it's like topics that keep coming up for reasons X, Y, and Z, right? And sometimes there is no like clear reason why it's coming up. Like you know, I think last year I did an issue on like where's the next Datadog, because like everyone was just like, there's not a new Datadog. I don't know where it is. Like there's like Chronosphere and Grafana and, you know, Honeycomb and Fiddler and all this other stuff, but like, and when you look at something like that, instead of this story being like, here's the next Datadog, it's more like, why are people saying they can't find one? And like, let's take a stab at it based off of everyone that I've talked to see like all the theories people have about like why there isn't a kind of like Datadog successor, or like someone that has like kind of like a real like major challenge, like poses like a major challenge to them. And that's just, you know, you talk to enough people and it keeps coming up over and over and over again. And that's not something that's like going to show up on, you know, PR Newswire or something along those lines, right? And so it's a lot of that, right? It's a lot of thematic coverage, and trying to understand like the direction things are going in. And I tell people I try to stay 6 weeks ahead of everyone else because that's about as good as I can do in this industry. But RAG, like retrieval augmented generation, like what was a band-aid, now permanent fixture in AI. People were talking about that in like May, June, July, and so it was like, okay, let's write about RAG.
It really did. When somebody told me that was a recommended approach for how to get good performance,
I was like, what?
Customized. Yeah, it was like, that seems like a total hack.
Yeah,
but it turns out it's like very effective.
Yeah. And then so, put an issue out, and then 3 months later, like it's in Wall Street Journal or like the information talking about like, hey, like RAG is this thing. It's like, yes, got it. And the only way you find out about that is like talking to people.
Can I use your 6 weeks ahead brain to give me some specific opinions on some different AI topics? First one, back in my younger days, went to business school. I love a good Harvard Business School case. I think that there should be case reasoning in like more domains. It's super fun. Do you think that there is, let's say that there's one HBS case that gets written about the last 18 months of AI? What's the case and what makes it interesting?
I'm not going to name any specific one company because the story hasn't really played out just yet all the way. So we're talking, like comes out later, right? Like not tomorrow. I think there's going to be a real question around a lot of these startups and apps that basically just use GPT-4 for everything and just like call like OpenAI APIs for everything. In the same way that like back in
The
again, I keep
wrappers.
going back to the stupid iPhone 4 stuff, but like some stuff's for wrappers on top of Foursquare, right? And like wrappers on top of like
Yep.
X and Y. And there will be like a number or small or large, like to be determined, right, of companies that were launched and funded and kind of like grew and then maybe like kind of like dropped off and hit that trough of blah blah blah, right? And some of them that were just like UX on top of an OpenAI call, right? Or Claude or Gemini or something on a Hugging Face space, like could be anything.
So essentially, you're saying the most interesting story here is like the search for moats. There's brand new general purpose technology. We actually don't know where to find moats today.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good example. And there are some companies that have done a pretty good job of that, right? It can be technical, it can be they've just gotten enough GPUs, right? Because those things are freaking expensive. So just having them as a moat in of itself, I feel like, or they have like a really powerful community, right? That's another, like Hugging Face is a good example where they just have this like very like big fan base, and that's just like it's GitHub, right? It's GitHub for AI, like that is locked up and taken, right? Don't even bother going after it because the story hasn't played out yet. We don't know what those moats are necessarily going to be. It could be the classic ones, right? It could be like the classic ones, just data community, team, right? Like all the normal ones, or it could be something new, right? Because like the challenge with the foundation models is, or the potential challenge with foundation models is that like if everything is trained on the same data, nothing is like you can't really discriminate against each other. There may be some like technical wizardry under the hood or optimizations that don't necessarily like can't be transferred back and forth, but it's not clear like how you create like a real staying power. Like data is probably the closest one insofar as like maybe I can collect data on how people are using my products and understand in better detail than company A or company C to my left and right, and refine my products more quickly or whatever. It's the same story as from 2010 all the way to 2024, right? At this point,
You were talking about foundation models. That's like my next question for you. Stuff in this world changes so quickly. Can you give me a sense for what your read is on the state of foundation models today in terms of the top three? And is there, over time, do you believe that this will be a commodity layer of the stack or a differentiable layer of the stack? Like, what's your best sense right now?
so the one side is like everyone racing to be the best, most powerful. Like you stick a question to me and I give you the correct answer every time. That's like the GPT-4s. That's Claude's, the Anthropic higher end models. That's Gemini Ultra, and whoever else decides to step in here to try and play there. There'll probably be a place for that. They're really expensive. Mistral Large, right? They're really expensive, and
So that's four, right? There's like
yeah, like basically
four that
yeah,
are kind of top
yeah,
end.
basically four.
Okay.
And when you look at how things have changed, what's changed in the last year, like they have not gotten cheaper. And you would expect these things to get cheaper over time because of like for any number of reasons, right? Like inevitably, like
Do you think that's just because they were losing money on them originally, and they're trying to not lose so much money?
They're really big and hard to run, right? They're powerful. They take up a lot of GPUs, which sucks up a lot of electricity. Which, like, there's another story. It's like the unsung heroes, the electricians, right, building all these data centers.
And both training and inference take GPUs, right?
Right. Yeah, with like a small caveat. But like, H100s are nightmarishly expensive, right? And there are not that many ways to like recoup the investment on it. So GPT-4 is like Tyrannosaurus size, like monster model. That one of the knocks on it is like it's not particularly reliable, right? Like it can be slow. You get rate limited. It's really expensive. But there's going to be use cases for it where I need like the exact best, most awesome answer of all time, and I will pay $50 for it or whatever, right? At some certain scale. But we haven't seen those like costs come down yet, and so to me, again, this is just to me, right? So I'm just like I'm just an observer trying to talk to as many people as I can, and I'm like not a PhD or an MLE or anything along those lines, because like I said, I washed out of math, right? And analytics, but it's not clear if the future is GPT-4, 4.5 Turbo 5, Claude 9 everywhere, or if it's a niche use case, right? Where for like companies that have like all the oodles of money, like they print cash and they're able to just they can afford it, right? And not naming names. Or they're like really specific use cases where like I for this one thing I need like extremely high accuracy, but I don't have a lot of data I can put into it, so I can't really do anything with RAG with it, right? And then there's the second part, which is where a lot of the crazy stuff is happening, which is that like middle layer, right? So this is like GPT 3.5, Haiku, Claude Haiku, all the open source stuff with Mistral.
And when you say crazy stuff, what do you mean?
So that's where the price wars are happening, right? Like you would expect, like, again, you would expect like kind of like people jockeying for price at the top end, and right now they're just jockeying for performance, right? But like the prices are like not like really dropping to like a level where you could like throw everything at it, right? But like at that middle layer for like Claude Haiku, GPT 3.5, Mixtral, and all the companies serving these open source models, that's like a battleground. Like everyone is going after everyone, try and get the price down as much as physically possible. So we're all like fighting with each other just for traffic.
So tell me about Grok. This is like where Grok is jumping in, and like they're not. I think
the hardware one, the chip, or
yeah, right. Have you read about them recently?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, I asked a lot of people about them.
Yeah, I used it recently for the first time. I was like doing some research. I'm writing about it this weekend. I mean, the tokens per second output in this thing is really nuts, and it seems like it's like quite cost competitive, and it gets all this from beginning kind of at the hardware level.
Yeah, and I mean, there's like a million custom silicon companies out there.
Yeah.
Like all of these things, and this is not limited to Grok, right? This is limited to like any technology, right? It's one thing to show off some insane new technology, including GPT-4, right? Or 4.5 Turbo or whatever, where that will come from, whatever comes next. It's another thing to scale it. And another thing for make it like ubiquitous, and not even like on a cost perspective, but like, can I get this up to 50 million QPS, right? And that's, I think the jury's still out on that for Grok, and like a lot of other places, right? Like it's not just Grok, again, it's not just Grok specifically. I still think the jury is out on the scaling part of it, on the commercialization part of it, because I think they, if I'm remembering correctly, they also have like rate limits on it and throughput limits on it, right? And so part of the like what the mid models are built for is scale. And like there's the extreme case of like 500 tokens per second, right? But there's also like 150 tokens per second, in some cases, right? And it's not clear like what's the UX difference between like 150 and 500, right? Because again, these apps are still being developed in real time. But what the mid models do is it's latency, reliability, and scale. Right, they're cheap enough to scale up, and they don't tend to fall apart at like a high enough QPS. Right, they're fast. They like most people would not be able to tell the difference between together GPT-3.5 Grok. Well, not Grok, right? But like no, most people would not be able to tell the difference between like together GPT-3.5, Claude Haiku, Amazon Bedrock, Gemini Ultra. Like the UX visual difference between like 100 and 300 TPS is like probably like not that crazy, right? And so that's where I think the major competitive pressure is coming from, because that's where open source models can actually be really competitive. And this is mostly Mistral's fault, right? Because like Mistral is actually an amazing model. And Mistral 7B is also like it's really good. And you see some situations where you have like Mistral overlooking Mistral to make sure it's giving the right answers, right? And so that's kind of branching off into its own market, where it's not just the foundation models fighting over it, it's all these other companies built on top of open source fighting for the same businesses and the same uses. And so what we're going back to again going back to the 11, 12, 13, like it's the sort of this whole new like commercial open source, right? Like what does commercial open source look like in AI? And it turns out that middle layer actually is like maybe that's what it looks like, right? Like commercialized open source on top of this middle layer, because it's really hard to put distance between each other, right? Not from like a potency perspective, from a UX perspective, I think, right? What's 4 points on this benchmark when all I need is something that's just going to pull correct information from my database. So I don't even need it to I don't need it to be the single greatest, like most accurate model in the world if I'm pulling correct information anyway, right? I know it's going to be coming because it's like, through RAG architecture.
I want to hit you with a couple more before I have to let you go. This is a question that I'm sure neither of us knows the answer to, but I'm interested to see if you have a take on this. You mentioned the Transformer paper, Attention is All You Need, back in 2017, I think. We're now around 7 years into that innovation, and we are seeing some pretty fantastic things come out the other end of it. Do you feel like we are, certainly there's like a lot more products to be built there, but the models themselves seem to have gone through this like really significant quality incline over, I don't know, let's say 2020 through 2023 time period. And I'm curious if you have any sense of like, are we still on this exponential curve on performance in purely the transformer architecture, or are we going to have to start adding, like, reevaluate the like underlying architecture to get more capabilities at the rate that we've been going?
Well, so there are a couple companies that are like looking at alternative architectures. So I think Striped Hyena out of Together is one of the ones that is looking at like alternatives to transformers, because like hypothetically there is a wall, right? There's a scaling wall. Eventually,
yep. There's only so much text in the internet.
Like there's only so much text in the internet, or words you rip off YouTube or whatever, right? Using Whisper. Or like any other source of data. And also there are only so many GPUs, and also there's only so much electricity, right? So it's like, it turns out like this innovation where if you threw more data and more power into this approach, you get better results, is great until you like run out of data, right? And then until you run out of like, until things become cost prohibitive and all that other stuff, right? And so there is like investigation into alternative architectures. It's it's very early, obviously, and there's also investigation into like heavy duty optimizations for these approaches, right? So like speculative decoding is one approach, right? And so is I mean, I could rattle off like 50 of these, right? But like optimizations for how to make things faster, use less compute, do a better job of like guessing the next thing, right? Eventually, like every tech hits a wall,
but it's not clear that we know what the next thing is yet. The next thing, there's like experimentation going on around it.
Yeah, and I think that part of what's like, there's just like a lot of stuff happening, and part of what's going on is like the use of GPUs for AI is like still like relatively speaking relatively new, right? Back to I think 2015 was the Alex, or 2014 was the AlexNet paper. I'd have to look it up. Don't quote me on that specific date, right? But in the grand scheme of things, that's like not that old. But currently, like, while everyone's using GPUs, there's a ton of like stuff happening. It's like, what can we offload to a CPU, right? Because we have way more CPUs than we have GPUs, and they're just kind of sitting there, usually just not doing anything. So what can we do with that? What are some alternative architectures to GPUs that we could investigate, such as like Cerebrus just unveiled this like gargantuan chip, the size of like a tablecloth, right? And like that's one way, right? Because like the limiting physics is like point A going to point B, like how fast can you move that back and forth, right? That bit of data back and forth. So like what's that? And then what are the development layers on top of that, right? So like how can we be smarter about moving data across multiple different GPUs to process it and combining it back up at the very end? Because we've just been using PyTorch, which is a go-to framework for all this stuff. And so there's emerging stuff like there's like Mojo from Modular, which is a bunch of like really really famous developer guys working on it, right? There's Jax out of Google, which you don't see that much out of Google, but it's interesting, right? There's some interest there, and that as an alternative to PyTorch. And so there's a lot of optimization to be done still. You could just look at just like the amount of work being put into just the optimization component, right? And this hasn't really changed that much, right? Like that this it's still like a flat glass slate, but what we've gotten is more sensors in there. We've gotten more lenses. We've gotten more more powerful chips, and like different chip architecture, obviously. But like the iPhone is like a feat of engineering, and like feats of engineering can get better, improve over time with optimizations, right? And so I think the same thing is like this. Yeah,
I think that the thing that we need to do next as an industry is make sure that there's enough cash flowing through the system. The iPhone got better because a shitload of people bought one, and there was the clear business case to like continue to make it better. And right now, there is some value flowing through the system, but there's also just a lot of excitement, and we need to convert that excitement over into real value.
Yeah, and there's also something to be said about like all this stuff came out of academia. All of the people that are building these crazy technologies, like they were all academics and working in research labs. I mean, the same with Spark, right? And some of these other foundational technologies. Like that needs to continue to be fostered, right? Because like these like this is the birthplace of like a lot of these technologies is in a research lab somewhere. And so like it can't just all go to the Googles and the Metas and all that other stuff. Like you have to make sure that you're able to foster that kind of development. And to your point, we're still figuring out like the businesses behind it too. Yeah.
I know I'm running out of time with you. I want to ask you one more question, maybe bring it back around to the world of analytics. You have written about metadata generally, and maybe metadata companies or platforms more specifically being very relevant in the age of AI. Can you say more about that? What is your belief about how kind of metadata about structured data analytics can be incorporated into AI or drive value?
Yeah. So for a long time, I think that the notion of being able to use AI was I need to have a GPU in my VPC and I need to host it myself. I can't trust sending OpenAI my data or any of these APIs, right? Because for pick a reason, right? And open source is like really hard to use, right? What's changed in the last 4 months or so, I'd say, maybe 5, call 4, is the same principles that made Snowflake possible have it accessible through an abstraction layer like Databricks or Snowflake, right? Do, it turns out, naturally extend to the usage of AI, which is basically like really aggressive lineage and maybe even a higher bar than like typical analytics, right? Because I need to know like what's going into the model and what's coming out and like all that kind of stuff, right? Or how it's trained or how it's customized. And IAM, I think, is a big thing too, right? So like permissioning and access management and all that kind of stuff, right? And all these kind of like governance tooling, all these kind of governance requirements, observability, like evaluation on the other side, right? It increasingly that is an option to getting these things into production, which like Snowflake and Databricks like justifiably recognized, and because they just both announced Mistral models are going to be on their platforms. because they have all those like all those governance tools are baked in and built in already, right? So we can just like, okay, like click here, like here's your Mistral model, right? It's not clear like how that's going to work with like OpenAI and some of the other foundation models providers. Like most people expected OpenAI to crack it at some point, I think, but that means that the same tooling that went into us moving into a more ELT abstraction mindset for data capture and access and like an analysis, we can use the same tools and apply them to AI, right? And apply them to like getting a chatbot into production that will not, give a plane ticket away to a customer for free, right? And hopefully, and all the companies that like were powering this were, have like a kind of like a second shot at fitting into like new emerging workflows, right? So anyone who's working in Lineage, anyone who's like the catalogs, I think are all like in a really good position, right, to like kind of have a second go round here around governance and Lineage, and the observability layers all have like a shot at a second go round here. And all of this again is like you still need high quality data in the first place to do anything with it, right? Because like, say I want to run like a customer chatbot, right? It should probably know about my products and like should probably have like a history of like my company and all that kind of stuff. So it needs to get stuff from me specifically to achieve like the specific goals I have for it. And so you still need the same data quality tooling, the same stuff we used for Snowflake and Databricks. So it's like, again, like everything old is new again, like it comes back around for a second time. It's just this time it's for some non-deterministic use case that like we really hope to God is right.
Right.
So
I am, speaking for a second, not as a podcast host, but as a CEO of a company in the space, I fully agree that these worlds are converging. They felt very far apart 18 months ago, and I think that they are absolutely converging. And if you're in the infrastructure space, then the more downstream applications are fed by your infrastructure, the better. Like you want to create value on top of infrastructure. When we built the interstates, we actually didn't know that there was going to be fast food, but it turns out that there's a lot of use cases for infrastructure once it exists. I hope that AI is not fast food, but still, the point. I
stands. Mean, right now it's like kind of
it is maybe a little bit fast foody. We got about halfway through the things I wanted to talk to you about, so maybe one day we'll have to do this again. But this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for joining me to chat today.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, this episode's going to come out and it's already going to be old information and like
that's why you can't do a podcast in the space because it in the time you edit it, it's old.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, maybe 10% of this is still relevant in the next 72 hours or so. But
Matt, thanks for joining us, and everyone who hasn't should check out your newsletter, Supervised.
Awesome, thank you so much.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs. I'm your host, Tristan Handy. Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com with comments and guest suggestions. Our producers are Jeff Fox and Dan Poppy. If you enjoyed the show, drop us a review or share with a friend. Thanks for listening.